Somewhere on Earth, an entire country is preparing for the possibility that it may not exist by the end of this century. Its government has already signed agreements to relocate its own people without taking away their nationality. It has begun creating a digital version of its islands, culture, and history so that if the land disappears, the nation won't disappear with it. And its own leaders have stopped talking about climate change. They now use a far more frightening word, extinction. None of that is science fiction. All three of those countries exist today in 2026, and you can look up every one of these facts yourself. So here's the question worth sitting with. What does it actually mean for a country to cease to exist? Because it turns out there isn't just one way for that to happen. A nation can vanish because the land it sits on physically disappears beneath rising water. A nation can vanish because its population simply stops reproducing itself, generation after generation, until there's nobody left to be a citizen of anything. And a nation can vanish because war, conflict, or absorption erases its sovereignty entirely, even while the land and some of the people remain. Three completely different mechanisms, three completely different timelines. And when you actually rank the real countries facing each of these fates, using real demographic projections, real sea level science, and real government statements, the results are more specific, and in some cases more imminent than almost anyone expects. Let's rank them from least urgent to most. If you want to see exactly how close some of these countries already are, hit like and subscribe now, because the data on the country at the very top of this list is going to surprise you. Before we start ranking, it's worth being precise about what we're even measuring, because these are genuinely different phenomena with genuinely different mechanics. The first mechanism is physical erasure, land that is simply going underwater permanently due to rising sea levels driven by climate change. This is the most visually dramatic form of national disappearance, and it's playing out in extremely precise, well-documented ways in a handful of low-lying island nations right now. The second mechanism is demographic collapse, a population whose birth rate has fallen so far below the replacement level that generation after generation, there are simply fewer and fewer people until a country's population base effectively empties out from within. This one doesn't require a single dramatic event. It requires decades of a number quietly staying too low, compounding year after year until the mathematics become almost impossible to reverse. And the third mechanism is geopolitical dissolution. Sovereignty lost to war, conflict-driven depopulation, occupation, or absorption into another state. This is historically the most common way nations have actually ceased to exist throughout history, and it remains an active risk today in specific identifiable places. Ask yourself, as we go through this list, which of these three fates would you consider? Genuinely ceasing to exist? Because by the time we get to the top of this ranking, you may find your answer has changed. There's also a fourth mechanism worth naming, even though it doesn't produce an entry on today's list: outright military conquest and annexation. The way empires have erased smaller states throughout most of recorded history, that mechanism still exists as a live risk in parts of the world today, but it's harder to rank using clean, comparable data the way we can rank sea level projections or fertility statistics. What we're building today is a ranking grounded specifically in numbers that governments, scientists, and international institutions have already published, not speculation about future wars that haven't happened yet. One more thing worth establishing before we start: none of the countries on this list are failed states in the traditional sense. None of them are currently experiencing famine, civil collapse, or a breakdown of basic governance. Every single nation on this countdown has a functioning government, a seat at the United Nations, and citizens going about ordinary daily life right now. That's actually what makes this ranking unsettling in a way that stories about collapsing failed states usually aren't. These are stable, internationally recognized, functioning countries, several of them wealthy and technologically advanced, that are nonetheless staring down a data-driven, mathematically documented possibility of their own disappearance. We start with the case that's real, well-documented, and genuinely alarming to demographers, but sits furthest from any realistic timeline of actual national disappearance: Bulgaria. Bulgaria's population has fallen from nearly 8.95 million people in 1985 to roughly 6.42 million at the end of 2024, a decline of close to 30% in under 4 decades. In 2025 alone, Bulgaria recorded just over 50,000 live births against nearly 100,000 deaths, meaning the country's death rate is now running at almost double its birth rate. The country loses population every single day. Bulgaria's own Center for Demographic Policy has cited a decline of roughly 8 people per day from natural causes alone. Projections from the United Nations suggest Bulgaria's population could fall by a further 18 to 20% by 2050. Why does Bulgaria rank last on this list despite numbers that would sound catastrophic in almost any other context? Because the mathematics, however grim, still project a country of several million people persisting for many generations to come. Bulgaria isn't disappearing. It's shrinking, aging, and hollowing out. Entire rural settlements are being abandoned, even as new, empty housing gets built in cities. But there's no plausible near-term scenario where Bulgaria's government or sovereignty ends. It's the canary in the coal mine for a trend that gets far more severe as we move up this list. It's also worth noting Bulgaria isn't alone in this pattern. It's simply the most extreme example of a trend running across much of Eastern Europe. Latvia has lost roughly a fifth of its population since joining the European Union in 2004. Lithuania and Moldova have each lost close to a fifth of their populations since the year 2000. Romania isn't far behind. The common thread across all of these countries is the same one driving Bulgaria: young, working-age citizens leaving for higher wages in Western Europe combined. With birth rates that were already below replacement level before the emigration even started. Demographers sometimes describe this as a double squeeze. A country loses people to emigration and simultaneously fails to replace them through births, so the population math compounds against it from two directions at once rather than just one. Ukraine's population trajectory looks, on paper, even steeper than Bulgaria's, and it earns a higher spot on this list because of just how compressed its timeline has become. Ukraine's population peaked above 52 million in 1993. By 2020, before the full-scale Russian invasion, it had already fallen to roughly 43.7 million, driven by the same low birth rate, high immigration pattern affecting much of Eastern Europe. Then came February 2022. The United Nations estimates net outward migration from Ukraine hit 5.7 million people in that single year alone. By 2025, Ukraine's population sat at an estimated 32.9 million, a cumulative loss of roughly a third of its population since 2000. Ukraine's death rate in 2025 was outpacing its birth rate by nearly 3 to 1. Even before the war, Ukraine's peacetime birth rate of roughly 9.2 per 1,000 people was already running well below its death rate of about 15.2 per 1,000, meaning the war didn't create Ukraine's demographic crisis, it simply poured fuel on one that was already burning. And here's the detail that should genuinely concern anyone thinking about Ukraine's long-term future. A March 2025 study by Ukraine's own Center for Economic Strategy found that only 43% of Ukrainian refugees living abroad still intend to return home, down sharply from 74% just 2 years earlier. The longer displaced Ukrainians build new lives abroad, new jobs, new schools for their children, new communities, the less likely that return migration becomes, regardless of how the war itself eventually resolves. Ask yourself what that declining intent to return actually means for a country trying to rebuild. Ukraine's fate here isn't really about the war ending or not ending. Even in the most optimistic ceasefire scenario, the country faces a demographic hole that its own citizens increasingly may not come back to fill. Ukraine ranks above Bulgaria specifically because its decline has been violently compressed into a handful of years, rather than stretched across 4 decades. But, like Bulgaria, the most likely outcome is still a much smaller, poorer, older Ukraine, not the actual disappearance of the state. Now we reach the country that demographers increasingly describe using words that would have sounded absurd a generation ago: national extinction. South Korea's fertility rate, the average number of children a woman is expected to have in her lifetime, fell to roughly 0.72 in 2023, recovered only marginally to around 0.74 to 0.75 in 2024, and remains, by a wide margin, the lowest fertility rate ever recorded by any country in human history. For context, a country needs a fertility rate of 2.1 just to keep its population stable without immigration. South Korea is running at roughly a third of that number. In the capital, Seoul, the fertility rate has fallen as low as 0.55. Statistics. Korea's own official projections put the country's population, currently around 51.7 million, at just 36.2 million by 2072, a decline of roughly 30%, with some longer-range projections suggesting the population could effectively halve by the end of the century if current trends hold. The Bank of Korea has explicitly warned that a shrinking population could push the country into a permanent recession by the 2040s. By 2030, roughly a quarter of the entire South Korean population will be over the age of 65. Here's what makes South Korea rank higher than Bulgaria or Ukraine, despite the country having no war, no territorial threat, and one of the most advanced economies on Earth: population momentum. Once a fertility collapse this severe compounds across enough generations, there is, according to virtually every demographer who studies this, no policy lever left that can meaningfully reverse it in time. South Korea has already spent more than 360 trillion won, well over $1 billion, on birth rate incentive programs since 2006. The fertility rate kept falling anyway. Nicholas Eberstadt, a political economist who has studied Korean demographics for decades, put it bluntly. There is no realistic population policy that can lift South Korea's fertility back toward a sustainable level in any meaningful time frame. Ask yourself what a nation of aging, shrinking cities, empty schools, and a collapsing workforce actually looks like 50 years from now, when there are barely enough working-age adults left to sustain the pension system supporting everyone older than them. South Korea's government hasn't used the phrase national extinction lightly. It's a direct description of the mathematics. South Korea isn't alone in this particular category either. It's simply the most extreme case in a pattern spreading across all of East Asia. Japan's fertility rate has fallen from 3.6 in 1950 to roughly 1.2 today, with births declining by 5.7% in a single year, 2024 alone. Japan's population, currently around 124 million, is projected to fall to 87 million by 2070, with 40% of that remaining population over the age of 65. China's fertility rate has fallen to roughly 1.0, a stunning collapse for a country that spent decades actively trying to restrain population growth through its one-child policy, only to discover the restraint became permanent long after the policy itself was abandoned. But South Korea's numbers remain uniquely severe even within this regional pattern, and the reasons behind them are worth understanding because they're not simply about cost of living. Marriage rates in South Korea have collapsed even faster than birth rates, and the two are deeply linked in Korean society specifically. Because, unlike much of the West, childbirth outside of marriage remains rare. Only about 3% of babies in South Korea are born to unmarried parents, compared to roughly 40% in the United States, and over 50% in Sweden. That means Korea's marriage collapse translates almost directly into a birth collapse, in a way it simply doesn't in most other developed countries. The reasons young Koreans give for avoiding marriage and children read like a checklist of modern pressures, pushed to their absolute limit. Extraordinarily high housing costs concentrated in Seoul, one of the most competitive and expensive education systems on earth, demanding workplace cultures, and persistent gender inequality in both domestic labor and career advancement. The South Korean government has even floated the idea of offering military service exemptions to men who have multiple children, a genuinely unusual policy proposal that underscores just how seriously the country's national security establishment now views its own falling birth rate, given that a shrinking population directly shrinks the pool of young men available to defend against the security threat posed by North Korea. Now we move from demographic collapse to something even more visceral, countries that aren't shrinking in population, but are physically running out of land to stand on. If you want to see exactly which country is closest to genuinely vanishing off the map, subscribe now, because the final two entries on this list are almost impossible to believe are happening in our lifetime. For our second spot, we're looking at two Pacific nations facing a genuinely different kind of threat. Not a shrinking population, but a shrinking country. Kiribati, spread across 3 island groups in the Central Pacific, has already seen sea levels rise between 2 and 4 inches over the past 30 years. NASA's Sea Level Change team projects an additional 6 to nearly 12 inches of rise by 2050, and potentially 1.5 to over 3 feet by the end of the century, depending on global emissions. The ocean isn't just rising around Kiribati. It's actively contaminating the freshwater wells its population depends on, leaching salt directly into agricultural soil that islanders have farmed for generations. The Marshall Islands faces an even starker set of projections. According to a World Bank study, both the Marshall Islands and Kiribati could see 50 to 80% of their land submerged within the next 50 years. The World Bank's own November 2024 assessment described the roughly 200,000 people living across these Pacific atoll nations as facing some of the most severe existential threats from climate change of any region in the world. A single severe climate event in this region, the study noted, could now cause damage and losses equivalent to 50% of an entire nation's annual economic output. Ask yourself what sovereignty even means for a nation whose habitable land is measured in decades, not centuries. These are countries actively planning what amounts to their own eventual evacuation, while simultaneously trying to build seawalls and raised platforms fast enough to buy a few more decades of time. They rank above South Korea on this list because, unlike a demographic collapse that could theoretically be slowed by immigration or policy, they aren't alone either. The Maldives in the Indian Ocean has faced this same threat long enough that its government has already begun constructing a floating city as a contingency, a literal architectural response to the possibility that its existing land simply won't be there for future generations. What separates Kiribati and the Marshall Islands from a case like the Maldives is largely a matter of degree and geography. Smaller land masses, lower average elevations, and fewer resaw change even at the 11th hour, there is no policy lever on Earth that stops the ocean, Ursees to fund large-scale engineering responses. The economics here matter as much as the physics. Building seawalls, importing fill material to raise land, and relocating critical infrastructure all cost money that small island economies, dependent largely on fishing and tourism, simply don't have in the quantities that wealthier, larger nations facing similar coastal threats can draw on. And that brings us to the top of this list. The country that isn't just facing the theoretical risk of ceasing to exist, it's the country that has already, formally, legally, begun preparing for it. Tuvalu is one of the smallest nations on Earth, a chain of 9 coral atolls with a mean elevation of just 2 meters above sea level. Its sea level has risen 21 centimeters over the past 30 years, nearly double the global average rate. NASA and UN projections both converge on the same brutal conclusion. 95% of Tuvalu could be underwater during high tide by 2100. By 2050, within the lifetime of most people watching this, half of Tuvalu's capital atoll, Funafuti, home to 60% of the country's entire population, is projected to be flooded by routine daily tides, not even by a storm or an exceptional event. Just an ordinary Tuesday. Here's what makes Tuvalu different from every other country on this list, and why it earns the #1 spot. Tuvalu isn't waiting to see what happens. In 2023, Tuvalu signed a landmark treaty with Australia called the Falapili Union, a formal, legally binding agreement that, among other provisions, guarantees Tuvaluan citizens the right to migrate to Australia as climate conditions deteriorate, while explicitly committing Australia to recognize the continued statehood and sovereignty of Tuvalu, even if its physical territory eventually becomes uninhabitable or disappears entirely. Read that again. Two governments have already put in writing what happens to a nation's legal existence after its land is gone. And it goes further. In 2025, more than 90% of Tuvalu's entire population applied for the visa scheme created under that treaty. A staggering statistic that means the overwhelming majority of an entire nation's citizens have formally signaled their intent to leave the country they were born in, not because of war or economic opportunity, but because their government's own climate projections told them to. Back in 2022, Tuvalu's foreign minister, Simon Kofe, delivered a speech to the United Nations climate change conference standing inside a digital replica of one of Tuvalu's own islets, explaining that his government had begun digitizing the nation, its land, its culture, its history, specifically so that something would survive no matter what happens in the physical world. The very first landmark chosen for that digital preservation project was Te Fualiku, a small islet on the northern part of Funafuti, chosen specifically because it's projected to be the first piece of Tuvalu's territory to disappear completely beneath the waves. Think about the layers of what Tuvalu has actually done here. It hasn't just acknowledged the risk of disappearing. Most vulnerable nations do that much. It has built, in partnership with a much larger and wealthier neighboring country, an actual legal architecture for what continued nationhood looks like without continued territory. Under the Falapili Union, Australia has committed not only to accepting migrating Tuvaluans, but to helping fund Tuvalu's land reclamation and coastal adaptation projects, while explicitly affirming that Tuvalu's statehood, its maritime boundaries, and its sovereignty continue to be recognized regardless of what happens to the physical land itself. In the entire history of international law, there is no real precedent for a treaty of this kind, a formal bilateral agreement essentially ensuring a nation's legal existence against its own geography. Ask yourself what it means when a government's own foreign minister has to explicitly plan for the possibility that his country will move permanently online and disappear forever from the physical plane. His words, not a headline writer's exaggeration. Tuvalu is currently spending enormous resources reclaiming land and constructing seawalls, hoping to buy time out toward 2100. But the country that ranks first on this list isn't guessing about its own fate. It has already negotiated, in a signed international treaty, what its own disappearance is legally supposed to look like. So here's what this ranking actually reveals, once you put all 5 of these countries side by side. Bulgaria and Ukraine show us that a nation can hemorrhage a third of its population within a single generation, and still, mathematically, be expected to persist as a smaller, older, diminished version of itself for a long time to come. South Korea shows us something more unsettling, that an advanced, wealthy, technologically sophisticated democracy can throw over $1 billion at a demographic collapse and still watch the fertility rate fall anyway. Because once population momentum tips far enough in one direction, money alone can't buy back the missing generations. And Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, and Tuvalu show us the most literal version of this question of all. Nations where the land itself, the actual physical territory a passport represents, is running out of time on a schedule that scientists can now measure down to specific decades and specific centimeters. Every one of these countries still exists today. Every single one of their governments is still, right now, actively trying to prevent the exact outcome this list is measuring. But the honest, data-driven answer to the question in this video's title isn't really about which government fails first, or which war ends worst, or even which country runs out of land first, though Tuvalu's own treaty and its own citizens' visa applications make a genuinely compelling case that it's already furthest down that road of any nation on Earth. There's something worth pausing on here too. These 5 countries also represent, in miniature, most of the major forces reshaping the 21st century all at once. Climate change, driven overwhelmingly by the emissions of large industrialized economies, is erasing the sovereignty of small nations that contributed almost nothing to the problem in the first place. Tuvalu's total historical carbon emissions amount to a rounding error compared to the emissions of any G20 economy, and yet it's Tuvalu bearing the most existential cost. Meanwhile, some of the wealthiest, most developed nations on Earth are discovering that prosperity itself, ironically, appears to be one of the strongest predictors of a falling birth rate, as South Korea, Japan, and increasingly China are all learning in real time. And in Eastern Europe, the collision of economic integration, open borders, and war has produced a slow motion to population that nobody explicitly designed, but that may prove just as consequential over the coming century as any single dramatic collapse. The deeper answer is that ceasing to exist is no longer a purely historical question about ancient empires and medieval kingdoms. It's an active, measurable, ongoing process happening to real countries, with real governments, making real legal arrangements for what comes next, right now, in the decade you're living through. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If you had to bet on it, using nothing but the hard data we just walked through, which of these 5 countries do you think still exists in a form its current citizens would recognize 100 years from now? And which do you think won't? If this ranking surprised you as much as the data surprised me while researching it, subscribe and tell me in the comments which country you'd have ranked differently. I want to know what you think.